So it was just another day of practice, basketball practice, my favorite sport, hence the shirt. So practice began, and my coach was about 30 minutes late. He came in and he said, "Today's punishment day." And I was like, oh shit, today is punishment day. That means that today is the day that we don't do anything but run. And I was fat at the time. I was like 250, and I was not a runner. I barely even walked in the morning. So we start running, and I started to feel very lightheaded, like one of the worst feelings I've ever had. I felt kind of nauseous. I just felt gross all over. So I told my coach, "Hey, can I go get a water break?" And he was like, "Sure, go ahead, just don't be too long." And I was like, "Okay, thanks." So I go into the room and I'm like, shit. And I take the water and I'm like, okay. And I start drinking it and I look up and I'm like, oh God, I don't feel good. Okay, and my sister comes up next to me and she's like, "Hey, you doing okay?" And I was like, yeah, I'm okay. And she was like, "Good, okay." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm just a little lightheaded." She was like, "Okay, that's fine." So I took my water and I took another sip and I looked up, and then I just remember going back. I saw the ceiling move and I was like, oh shit. And I hit the ground. I mean, it's the hardest feeling I've ever had on my head. It felt like a herd of elephants was running on the back of my head. The next thing I remember, there was a really good-looking paramedic to my left, and he's trying to put an IV in my arm. He's lucky he was good-looking, because if he wasn't good-looking, we would have had some issues. So I said, "What the hell are you doing?" And he was like, "Just stay calm, ma'am." And I was like, "Okay," and I knocked out. So we get to the hospital, and I turn to my right, and my sister's holding my hand. And she was like, "Katie, are you going to be okay?" And I was like, "I don't know what happened." And she was like, "Okay, well, you're going to be okay, okay?" And I was like, "Okay." And I turned, and my mom's like, "Katie? Katie?" And I was like, "Yeah, Mom." And she was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Well, since no one's telling me what the hell happened, I guess so." And she was like, "Well, Katie, you have 12 stitches in the back of your head. You cracked your head open, but you're going to be okay." And I was like, "Well, easy for you to say." And she was like, "Okay." So I lay there and I looked up, and my eyes just closed again. I faded away. And so as I'm looking at the ceiling, I'm like, God, this is horrible. Like, I kept fading in and out. And I just remember thinking, this is like the worst feeling ever, because I had no feeling at all. I couldn't feel my legs, couldn't feel my arms. All I felt was a pressure in my head. The next day, the doctor says, "Get up and walk." And I was like, well, okay. So I tried to move, and I couldn't move my legs. And he said, "Well, that's not good." And I had a neck brace on. So I got a little worried. And he said, "Well, you're going to be okay." And I said, "Well, okay, I guess." So I stood up with his help, and I started walking, and I was just fine. And he was like, "Okay, we're going to release you now." And I was like, "Well, right now? What do you mean right now?" And he was like, "Well, in about an hour, we're going to release you." And I said, "Okay, that's fine." So I get released, and I go home. And at my house is my team members. They're all waiting there for me. They've got like a big sign, and they're all telling me that they love me. And I said, "Well, thanks, guys, and this means a lot to me." And they were like, "Yeah, no problem." And I looked at one of my team members, and her name was Ashley, and I said, "How are you?" And she was like, "Good." And I said, "Okay." And I just remember looking up again, and I went back. I don't know what was happening to me. They told me when I got to the hospital, they did a EKG, they did a bunch of tests on my head, and they let me know that I had a seizure. I don't know what kind of seizure. I wasn't listening. My mom was panicking. She was holding my hand, and she let me know I did have a seizure, though. And I said, "Well, where do I go from here?" And she said, "Well, you're not going to be able to play basketball for the rest of your season." It crushed me. It was my senior year. So I said, "Well, if I can't play basketball the rest of the season, what am I supposed to do during school?" Because that was my only activity. She was like, "Well, I guess we're going to have to start Weight Watchers." Because I was really fat. I was really fat. And I was like, "Okay, well, I guess we'll start Weight Watchers then." So we sat there and we decided how we were going to start Weight Watchers. And that day I started eating better and I started to feel better. And it turned out to be one of the best days of my life, because my first day, the next day I stepped on the scale and I was down about 3 pounds, just from drinking water and eating better. Bad day because I fell and it was horrible, but it turned out to be one of the best days of my life because I felt loved by my team and I felt like I was appreciated and I felt like I was a part of something, even though I couldn't play the rest of my season. So that was the best day of my life.